Hey, all, Pastor Jake here. Just wanted to take a minute and tell you a little bit about what we're going to do with family worship. We're still going to be putting out the articles that you can find and also the kids' video that goes with it, but we're going to add a little bit of a teaching time to give you guys a little bit more meat on the bone for you guys to be able to talk about, not just with each other, but also with the kids. And so it gives us a little more time to be able to absorb what the text is saying here. And today we find ourselves in First Samuel chapter 17. And, this is a story that I think people in Christianity and out of Christianity know. It's a story of David and Goliath. As well, I think it's largely known, but I'm wondering how much of the truth of the text is really found in that. And so I think most people would, say that David and Goliath has everything to do with, you being able to conquer the Goliaths, the giants in your life. And ultimately, that's not really what's going on here. And so while this isn't going to be exhaustive by any stretch of the imagination, there are two big themes that I want us to see in this text. And the first is just the really simple of the bigness of God and the smallness of man, meaning that, man, God's big and we're not. The next one I want us to see is that God is faithful to rescue his children. So the first one when we look at the bigness of God and the smallness of man, I want us to see that this is not a story about the little guy beating the big guy, right? This is ultimately a story that's about the really big guy, meaning God, defeating the little guy, meaning Goliath. And so it's important to remember that as we approach Scripture, that God is creator and we are his creatures. So while we are creatures that are designed and created to bear his image, we are creatures nonetheless. And so it's important that we just really see that God is really big. And I know is that, especially for grownups as we've gone through life and, become cynical and everything, that it's easy to lose the bigness of God and what that is. And so I just want us to kind of rekindle that childlike faith of really seeing God for who he is. Man, he's creator and we are not. And he is big. And so ultimately what I want us to see is the bigness of God and the smallness of man. And the next theme I really want us to look at is the faithfulness of God to rescue his children. And so, for the last really decade, we've seen a constant stream of comic book superhero movies, and it's just kind of normal in our culture now to be able to talk about that. And I think one of the things we always have to fight against is the idea of being the hero. We all want to be the hero, right? I mean, especially, from childhood, you see kids and, man, they're dressing up in superhero outfits and using pillowcases for capes and all of that. And so we've been kind of conditioned to feel like the ultimate goal for us is to be the hero. But ultimately what I want us to see that is we are never the hero, not only in our stories, but in other people's stories. Jesus is the hero, end of story with it, right? And so this morning in men's Bible study, we talked about, even how like as guys, we like to tell, fishing stories, right? This idea that, we caught a fish, but, it's never as big as we say it is, right? And then the story we always are, we're saying that it's this massive fish, but it really wasn't. And ultimately we do all of that stuff to make ourselves look more heroic. And so at the end of the day, I think in our lives, there is a danger of relying on our own self-sufficiency and not leaning into God, and not just on our own lives, but in how we operate in and out of the church. And so, we never want to rely on our own self-sufficiency because Jesus is our hero. We are always the damsel in distress, right? We are never the hero in our story. Jesus is our hero in our story. And so when we look at David, David easily could have relied on his own self-sufficiency, right? Telling maybe the ultimate fishing story, to King Saul before he goes out to fight Goliath, is that while he was a shepherd, that he had killed lions and bears with his bare hands, right? And so there's none of us that can make that kind of claim that we had killed lions and bears with our bare hands. But David knew where his help came from, right? Psalms 121 says that I lift up my eyes to the hills, and where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. David knew full well where his help came from, and that was from God. And so while we are not David, right, the anointed future king of Israel, facing down a man 2 to 3 times our size with a sling and a rock, we are still rescued by God nonetheless. Jesus is our hero. We have been rescued. We have been redeemed. And it was through the finished work of Christ. And so declaring that Jesus is our hero in all things may seem like a real simple Christian thing to do, but I find that oftentimes, we change the language, we change the story to make ourselves look more heroic and less like needing to be rescued, less like the damsel needing to be rescued. And so I find in Luke chapter 9, Jesus is talking to his disciples, and in verse 18 it says that now it had happened that he was praying alone, and the disciples were with him, and he asked them, "Who do the crowds say that I am?" And so Jesus is with his disciples, asked them a very simple question. It's like, who do people say that I am? And so they answered him, and it says some say John the Baptist, but others say Elijah, and others that one of the prophets of old has risen. And so their answer to Jesus was that ultimately people really didn't know. They were saying that, man, he was John the Baptist that had been risen, realizing that John the Baptist was already killed. He was already martyred. They didn't know that. They were saying maybe he was Elijah. Maybe he was another prophet that had risen, but ultimately they didn't really know. And so Jesus in verse 20, it says, and then he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answers very directly, the Christ of God. This is an answer that doesn't try to mince words. Ultimately, Peter says that Jesus is the one that has been sent to rescue and redeem that which was lost. And right there, it's just saying that Jesus is our hero. We are not our own heroes. I am not the hero for my children. I am not the hero for my wife. As much as I may want or like to be, I have to fight against that instinct, knowing that, man, Jesus is their hero too. Jesus is the hero. And so when we look at this, David knew full well that God was the hero, that God was the one that was rescuing him, and so when he says to Saul that God delivered or rescued him from the paw of the bear and the lion, and he will rescue me from this Philistine also. David knew full well that God is the hero, not only of his story, but everybody's story. And lastly, as we kind of close out, I want us to see something that that kind of confidence that we put in Jesus will look like foolishness to the world. So Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 1:18, he says, "For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God." And so just know that ultimately the world is not going to understand, and ultimately will think that you are acting out of foolish action, knowing and putting your faith in God like that. I gotta believe that when the world looked at David, this small boy that was going to ultimately go and fight this giant, huge man, they saw that as foolishness, man. They saw that, man, he was throwing his life away. But ultimately, David knew how big God is. And he also knew how he is faithful to rescue his kids. And so, man, as you guys kind of go through this story, I want us to find areas that you guys can point to and look at how God has rescued you from something. Like I know that for Christians, man, we have our testimony that he has saved us. He has, rescued and redeemed us. But also just in normal everyday stuff in my life, I can point to areas where, man, God saved me from something. And it's funny how a lot of times those were maybe answers to prayer, meaning that they were no's. Thinking that, man, if I just had this, or if I just needed this, or if God, you just do this or move this way, my life would be better. And, on the backside of that, being able to see that, the answer to that prayer being no ultimately was God rescued me from some things. And so, as you're able to kind of talk just amongst yourselves and with your kids about this, I want us to see that this story, has everything to do with the bigness and faithfulness of God, and has nothing to do with our own ability to face down our own giants. So with that said, man, I just want you to know, man, we love you guys. We miss you guys. I'm grateful for the digital way we're able to communicate, but I also know it's a cheap substitute for us actually being able to gather as the people of God. And so looking forward to when we're able to do that. And man, if you guys have anything, prayer requests, need anything, don't hesitate to be able to call me or Pastor LaRon, and just know that the church as a whole is here for all of you guys. And so, man, love you guys, and we will see you soon. Bye.